announcements. One is this one here, the Center for Global Health and the Center for Community Engagement, is that what it stands for? Are sponsoring a colloquium here, the biology colloquium series will be on summer research internship availabilities and how to find them and how to get them. That will be here in this room at noon on Thursday. I would also like to announce, this is just the Moodle page. This is what I see on Moodle. You probably see something, similar. So, here's the course syllabus. Here's the course schedule if you've lost your hard copy. Here's the note about today's lab. Remember, today in lab is starting at 1 for everybody. And it will start in Stanley 044 because we can't all fit in the lab. If you can't come at 1 o'clock today because of a conflict, you're supposed to let me know which of the other two options for lab you prefer. I'm assuming if you can't come at 1 o'clock today, 1 o'clock is not your best option, but I still don't know which of the other two options is your preferred. If you don't tell me, I will be your proxy, but I will put you in whatever works for me. Okay? You can tell me after class, during the break, or send me an email. Alex?
If we come at 2:30, should we come till 2:30, or?
This will the whole thing will probably take about an hour. So we will be done by 2:30. And if you can't come until 2:30, you should send me a note about being your proxy. Also, notice on the Moodle is the link to the video channel, where Opie will be uploading the videos on a daily basis. If you scroll down, you'll see the key concepts. Here, you'll see the key concepts that hand out PowerPoint, the full PowerPoint, not just the handouts that I give you. A Word and a PDF version of the problem set that is due this coming Sunday, so you can start to work on it, or at least see what's on the problem set and be thinking about it as we're talking about this in class. Some of the problem set material is going to assume the knowledge that you get on Thursday, so it's, it might be too early to start on it, or at least some of it. And here's today's PowerPoint, which you can't see yet, but you'll be able to see after class. Okay, so the Moodle is, I try to keep it well organized. If I forget to do something like put up the PowerPoint, please just send me a quick email saying, can you put up today's PowerPoint? That's fine, that just means I forgot. Okay, so let's pick up a little bit where we were on Thursday. Here's a figure from your textbook that outlines the transporters that are important in human anatomy and physiology. Here are the primary active transporters. You can see here's the sodium-potassium ATPase. Here is the calcium ATPase. Now remember, there are two types. There's the PMCA in the plasma membrane and the SERCA in the SR or endoplasmic reticulum membrane. Both of those are calcium ATPases that pump calcium out of the cytoplasm and either into the lumen of the SR for SERCA, or the lumen of the ER for SERCA, or outside the cell for PMCA. And here's a proton pump that is important in many systems. The one that we will be focusing on in this case is the proton pump in the synaptic vesicle membrane, pumping protons into the lumen of the synaptic vesicle, building a proton gradient across the synaptic vesicle membrane, which is used by a antiporter there to pump neurotransmitter into the synaptic vesicle. We'll see this again. Primary active transporters, they are all ATPases. That's the definition of primary active transporters. And here are some secondary active transporters. A sodium amino acid cotransporter that we're not going to be talking about very much today in this course, except for the fact that some amino acids are neurotransmitters. And in fact, in that case, we're going to be talking about a sodium amino acid transporter in the cell membrane and a proton amino acid antiporter in the synaptic vesicle. So here is a co-transporter. Using the sodium gradient made by the sodium ATPase, sodium potassium ATPase, using that sodium gradient to pump amino acids. Here is a sodium proton exchanger. We won't be talking about that. Here is a sodium calcium exchanger that we will be talking about. In fact, that's the topic of one of the sets of questions on your problem set. A sodium calcium exchanger using the sodium gradient to pump calcium out. We won't be talking about the chloride bicarbonate exchanger in this course. And then, of course, a bunch of ion channels that we will also be talking a lot about. Voltage-gated sodium channels for the action potential. Resting and voltage-gated potassium channels used for the resting membrane potential and for terminating the action potential. Chloride channels are just there. Calcium channels are going to, voltage-gated calcium channels are going to be critical for calcium-dependent exocytosis or neurotransmitter release. So this is a slide that summarizes a lot of what you need to know from cell physiology with regard to ion transport. Okay, let's do a couple of minutes right here. So this is right as a W-R-I-T-E, not a R-I-T-E. So the sodium calcium exchanger catalyzes secondary active transport. It takes energy to pump the calcium uphill. One can make good arguments that this energy for calcium transport by the NCX comes from each of the following. So make an argument that the energy comes from each of these. We'll take 1 minute per these, just a few words. And in fact, I gave you space on your handout, but you can also use just a blank piece of paper. Let's take like 3 or 4 minutes, make an argument that the energy for NCX pumping of calcium comes from ATP, comes from mitochondria, comes from glucose, comes from the cell. Okay, let's do the first one. We'll see. Maybe we'll take another minute to do the other ones. Somebody want to make an argument that this energy comes from ATP, remembering that the sodium calcium exchanger is not itself an ATPase. Who wants to make the argument? Go ahead.
ATP is what creates the sodium gradient through the sodium potassium ATPase.
Right, so exactly. The sodium potassium ATPase uses the energy from ATP to make the sodium gradient that the NCX uses to pump calcium. Sodium potassium ATPase converts the energy in a high energy phosphoanhydride bond, so this is just another way of saying what I just said. Make the sodium gradient, which the NCX uses to pump calcium. Somebody make an argument that the energy that we're talking about comes from mitochondria. Mitochondria are the richest source of ATP, remembering that in the cytoplasm, remember from cell physiology, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, but oxidative phosphorylation that accounts for 90% of the ATP in our body comes from mitochondria, comes from oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria. So the ATP, most of the ATP that the sodium potassium ATPase uses comes from mitochondria. Glucose. Make an argument that this energy comes from glucose.
Is the source of energy for ATP production in mitochondria. So we need glucose to store glycolysis, and then from that oxidative phosphorylation,
Okay. Glucose is a food molecule that we use first with glycolysis, then with pyruvate oxidation, then the electron transport chain, then oxidative phosphorylation to make ATP. Glycolysis, acid cycle, electron transport, oxidative phosphorylation, convert energy contained in food molecules into ATP. So glucose is a food molecule. I could have put here comes from, fatty acid. Fatty acid is another rich source of energy from food. Okay? Make an argument that the energy comes from the sun.
Isn't it the production of ATP and NADH after the light reaction?
Are you answering the question, or are you asking about glucose?
Oh no, yeah, no. I'm answering the question for the sun.
Okay, go ahead.
So like the production after like the light reaction of like
Okay,
ATP.
yes.
So,
All of the energy on planet Earth comes eventually, you can trace it back to the sun, right? All of our food molecules come from plants, directly or indirectly. Plants are the only species on planet Earth that can convert the energy from sunlight into food molecules. And so all the energy that we get from food comes from the sun, one way or another. The sun uses nuclear fusion to create sunlight, which plants use in the light reactions to convert sugars into, well, this is actually light and dark reactions to make sugars. Okay, so energy. Let's switch gears completely for a moment, just for a minute, and do some anatomy. We're not going to do a lot of anatomy in this room. We're going to do most of the anatomy in the A&P, in the anatomy lab, but let's do some anatomy in this room. So, everybody point to your most rostral part, the most rostral part of your body. Rostral. This way. Towards the head. Caudal. Caudal means towards the tail. We don't have tails, so caudal is the opposite of rostral. It doesn't mean towards your butt, where your tail would be. It means just not rostral. Rostral, caudal. Somebody point to the most anterior part of your face. Anterior. Okay. Medial, towards the middle. Lateral, away from the middle. Proximal means near. proximity. Proximal means near. So proximal almost, it has to be a comparison. The part of my arm that is proximal to my body is my shoulder. The part of my arm that is distant from my body, is my fingertip. So proximal and distal means near and far away from some reference point. What does ipsilateral mean? Somebody volunteer a suggestion for on the same side. So again, ipsilateral means on the same side as the reference point, whatever reference. So if we're talking about the left side of the brain, the left hand is ipsilateral to the left side of the brain. Contralateral, the opposite side. Let's go over here. Flexion. Everybody stand up. Let's do some exercise. Okay, assume the anatomically neutral position. This is the anatomically neutral position. It doesn't feel neutral. It feels like you have to work to get your body does not hang in the anatomically neutral position. This is the anatomically neutral position. Okay? So get into the anatomically neutral position and flex your elbow. Flexion. This is flexing the elbow. Easy. Extend the elbow. Flex the shoulder. Flex both of your shoulders. Flexing the shoulder. What? No, this is rotation of the shoulder. This is medial rotation, this is lateral rotation of the shoulder. This is flexion of the shoulder. So go back to neutral, extend your shoulder. This is extension of the shoulder. I'm trying to do this without flexing my waist, my hip. Okay? Flexion, extension of the shoulders. Okay? Abduct the shoulders. Abduction. Abduction. Adduction. Abduction means moving away from the midline. Adduction means moving towards the midline. These are the verbs of anatomy, right? The movement, flexing the elbow, flexing the shoulder. Okay? We won't talk about rotation very much, but we will. I will ask you to identify flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. Rotation, supination, pronation are important for hardcore anatomists. And we won't do too much of that. Okay. Put your hands on your hips and flex your leg at the hip. This is flexion of the leg at the hip. Flexion, extension of the leg at the hip. Lift one foot off the ground and flex your knee. That's by flexing the elbow. And extend your knee. Okay? So we stand in an extended position. Flex your body at the waist, at the hip. Flexion, extension of the back. Okay? So these are words, they're in your coloring book. I forgot what page it is. These are words to study for anatomy. We'll get to sagittal, coronal, and transverse. Those are sections of the brain. Sagittal, coronal transverse. 3 dimensions, 3 planes of sectioning of the brain. Okay, so these are words to learn for anatomy. Remembering that anatomy is not just learning places, the names of muscles and bones and nerves, it's also learning the verbs, the movement of those parts of your body. All right, so now we're going to go back to physiology like we will spend most of the time in this room doing. What we're going to do is go on to talking about binding of ligands like neurotransmitters to receptors. We'll review very quickly the core concepts of receptors that you got from cell physiology, and we will talk about intracellular signaling pathways. So you'll remember struggling with these concepts in cell physiology. Binding. The ligand and the receptor form a ligand-receptor complex. When this reaction is at equilibrium, when the forward reaction is equal to the reverse reaction, and everything is at equilibrium, then we can define an association constant that is defined by the concentration of the complex divided by the concentration of the free uncomplexed ligand times the concentration of the free uncomplexed receptor. That's the definition of an association constant. All of these concentrations are when equilibrium is happening. So at equilibrium, there is a concentration of complex, a concentration of uncomplex receptor, and a concentration of uncomplex ligand. Those concentrations, if you plug them into this reaction, give you the association complex. The higher the concentration of ligand-receptor complex, the higher the K, which means the reaction likes, anthropomorphically, likes to go forward from left to right. The higher the Ka, the more the reaction likes to go forward, the more there is the complex at equilibrium. The reverse reaction happens. It's the unbinding reaction. The Kd, so the dissociation constant, is simply 1 over the association constant. So here, the ligand-receptor complex is in the denominator instead of in the numerator. It's just the inverse of association. But we will be using Kd more than Ka. Okay? In this class, we will be using Kd more than Ka. The higher the dissociation constant, the lower the affinity. That is to say, the more the reaction wants to be, the less complex is formed at equilibrium. A low Kd is associated with a high Ka, which is a reaction that likes to go forward. A high Kd, which is a low Ka, is a reaction that doesn't like to go forward. It's important to get those directions straight in your mind. The arithmetic is easy. The concepts of a high Ka means this reaction moves to the right more than a reaction with a low Ka. And then you can convert that into Kd. Yeah.
Why are we going to be using the dissociation constant?
Why? The units of Ka, so this is in millimolar, this is in millimolar, I mean, you know, look, this is in molar units, moles per liter. This is in moles per liter units. This is in moles per liter units. The units of Ka are in inverse molar. Molar to the -1 power. What on earth is a molar to the -1 power? It just doesn't make sense. The units of Kd are molar times molar divided by molar, which is molar. So the units of Kd are in molar units, which makes sense. And that's why we will mostly, that's one of the reasons why we will mostly be using Kd. It's also true that the Michaelis-Menten equation uses Kd, not Ka. We can substitute Ka in here, obviously, but it's simpler if we use, well, it's almost always drawn as a Kd. So this is the Michaelis-Menten equation that you hopefully recall from self-is, except that we're not talking about enzymes, so we're not talking about V, and we're not talking about Vmax. We're talking about the amount of binding and the amount that is maximally bound. We don't have to do enzymology. We just have to do binding in this, mostly in this case. So let's talk about how the Michaelis-Menten equation appears on a graph of the amount bound versus the concentration of ligand. Okay, let's just walk through this. When the concentration of ligand is low, 0, how much ligand is bound? 0. When the concentration of ligand is very high, how much ligand is bound? A lot. What's the shape of the curve that connects that point and this point? A rectangular hyperbola is the name of the curve. This is supposed to be, there's not supposed to be an inflection here, right? It's just a straight curve, right? To some maximal to some max. And the max determines on the number of receptors, the number of cells, da-da-da-da. It depends on the system. So there's the curve. When the amount bound is 1/2 Vmax, in this particular condition, this particular point defines the Kd of this binding condition. Okay, so this is the Kd for the binding of some ligand to some receptor. This value, the Kd, more than the Vmax, defines the receptor-ligand interaction. It defines the affinity. The tendency for the ligand to bind to the receptor. Affinity is an important concept in ligand-receptor interactions. Okay, so there's a receptor for a ligand. Let's say that this is the trying to think of a good receptor. This is the AMPA receptor for glutamate. Just using words. The AMPA receptor for glutamate. There are multiple AMPA, so an AMPA receptor for glutamate has a certain affinity for glutamate, and that affinity is defined by the KD. There are multiple AMPA receptors for glutamate. Some of them have a higher affinity for glutamate than others. What will the curve look like for a high affinity AMPA receptor, or high affinity receptor? Let's do this together. And let's assume we have the same Bmax. So we have the same number of high, this is not good. We have the same number of high affinity receptors as we have, so the same number of red receptors as green receptors. But the red receptors have a higher affinity than the green receptors. Higher affinity. What's it going to look like?
You're going to have a much steeper initial slope.
That's right. You're going to have a steeper slope.
But it'll still eventually go to near Bmax and then just sort of level off.
It will still be a rectangular hyperbola with the same Bmax. The red receptor has a higher affinity. Does the red receptor have a higher or lower KD? A lower KD. Here is 1/2 Bmax. Here is the KD for the red receptor. A lower concentration of ligand is necessary to get half of the receptors occupied in the red high affinity receptor compared to the green lower affinity receptor. Is that clear? Okay, let's do one more of these. We're going to talk about a low affinity receptor. Okay? What's it going to look like? Somebody decide on that. Ken?
It's basically just how it so like,
So we're going to start here.
yeah.
Are we going to end here?
Yeah,
Assuming we have the same number of receptors. So here's the low affinity receptor. It's going to go to the same Bmax. Well, maybe or maybe not, depending on the concentration. What's it going to look like?
it's gonna go underneath.
Exactly. It's going to go underneath. It's going to have a shallower beginning point. But it will also have a rectangular hyperbola. It's going to this Bmax, it's just not getting there on this scale. So this is not a data point. It's got the same Bmax if we went further up, if I went to the next screen. What's the KD for this one? Well, it's higher. The KD is higher with the low affinity receptor. Okay, affinity. Let's go to inhibitors. Okay. Presence of inhibitors. Well, okay, let's start with the absence of an inhibitor. We've got that one? Well, I'll start with the same color I started with, green. So here is our receptor. Here's our Bmax. So a receptor with a given Vmax is then Kd. Just the receptor. Now, what does it look like in the presence of a competitive inhibitor? A drug that also binds to the same site on the receptor and competes with the ligand for occupying that site. Let's walk through this. At zero concentration of ligand, will we have any in the presence of the inhibitor? Remember, the inhibitor is not this constant. This is the concentration of the ligand. We have some fixed concentration of inhibitor present now in the orange case. Not present in the green case, present in the orange case. In the absence of ligand, where's the data point? Zero. No ligand, no binding. In the presence of a very high, concentration of ligand, what is the Bmax in the orange case, Kendra? The Bmax is going to be lower in the presence of a super high concentration of ligand. The amount it's going to go to is lower. Anybody want to disagree with Kendra? In the presence of the inhibitor, but remember, it is competing with the ligand for the same site. So now we have some fixed amount of inhibitor, but we're adding more and more of the ligand. Shahid.
It's gonna be the same.
It's going to have the same Bmax, because if we add more and more ligand, the ligand is going to outcompete the inhibitor. They're competing. So, okay, so we're going to have the same Bmax. Is the curve going to look the same? No, it's got an inhibitor present. So at any intermediate concentration, the amount bound in the presence of the inhibitor is going to be less than the amount bound in the absence of the inhibitor. Inhibitor, less binding. But when we go to a super high concentration of ligand, this is working very well, but you can see what's happening here. I am drawing a curve that is going to the same Bmax, but not getting there on this scale. But if I were to draw all the way up, into the hallway, I would get there eventually. The apparent, so in this case, now in the presence of the inhibitor, the apparent Bmax, so the apparent Bmax is the same. Apparent because it's what it appears to look like in the presence of the inhibitor. In the presence of the inhibitor, the apparent Bmax is the same, and the apparent Kd is higher in the presence of the competitive inhibitor. Questions about this? What if there's like a non-competitive inhibitor? Is that where you're going? Great. Let's go there. A non-competitive or allosteric inhibitor does not compete, but it is an inhibitor. It doesn't compete. So let's just start. At zero concentration of ligand, there would be zero binding. At a high concentration, remember we've got some of the inhibitor present, and it doesn't compete. So no matter, it doesn't compete. That is to say, the ligand does not compete with the inhibitor. So no matter how high a concentration of ligand we have, no matter how high this goes, it's only going to go to some value that is less than it was in the presence of in the absence of the inhibitor. Remember, now we're comparing black and green, not black and orange. Orange was the competitive inhibitor. Black is the non-competitive inhibitor. But the properties of the receptor, so this is the B max apparent for a non-competitive inhibitor. But when the receptor, so it's an inhibitor, so that the amount bound at each of these concentrations is going to be lower than it was in the green case. Here is the new apparent Emax, right? Here is the new half apparent Bmax, right? So this is now the new Bmax in the presence of the non-competitive inhibitor. Then this is the half Bmax in the presence of the non-competitive inhibitor. Let's see how well I do. The KD, the apparent KD for the non-competitive inhibitor is the same as the KD in the absence of the inhibitor. So bottom line, a competitive inhibitor changes the apparent KD, and a non-competitive inhibitor changes the apparent Bmax. Yeah. Because in the present, because when there is an inhibitor present, but it's not competing, some of the receptor is now unavailable to be bound, but it's not competing. It's acting at a different site. So I could cartoon this, but it would look really ugly. But the idea is the non-competitive inhibitor is preventing the ligand from binding, and no matter how high a concentration of ligand, there are sites that are not available. There are sites that are not available to be bound, no matter how high the concentration of ligand. But those sites that are available to be bound behave just like they would in the absence of the inhibitor. There was another question. Do you want to answer it? Okay, so these are key concepts of binding and affinity. And your book goes through some of them, and we won't go through the figure in the book because we just went through it better than the book does. Just to point out, in the book, this is the figure that does what we just talked about. And it's lumping both of those figures that we just went through. Here's the high affinity receptor. Here's the low affinity receptor, no inhibitor. Here is the high affinity receptor in the presence of a competitive inhibitor. Same Bmax, different apparent KD. And it doesn't show you what it looks like in the presence of a non-competitive inhibitor. So we've done more than the book has done. Give yourself a pat on the back. Okay, so let's activate here a little bit. Let's do a clicker. Let me answer the first question. best. Oh, it says we're looking at the best answer. Okay, most of you are showing me the right answer. The best answer is if it expresses more of a certain receptor type, but the receptor is the receptor, no inhibitor, no change in infinity, we're just making more receptor. Emax is great. It's just scaling up the curve. If cell A, okay, most of you got that right. Those of you who didn't need to think some more about what it means, what the number of receptors, or how Bmax is determined by the number of receptors, but the KD is determined by the property of the receptor. If cell A expresses a receptor type with a higher affinity than cell B, which are the following are true? Again, one best answer. So you're missing. Just leave it alone. The best answer is C. Higher affinity means lower KD, but I didn't give you any information about Bmax because I didn't tell you about which cell has more receptors than the other cell. Okay? So now let's talk about the types of receptors, and we'll take a short break. This is a figure from your textbook, from your physiology textbook, that goes into the types of receptors. And I'll be honest, the types of receptors that we're going to be talking about are 2 of these 4 in this course. We're going to be talking about ligand-gated ion channels, and we're going to be talking about G-protein coupled receptors. We're not going to be talking about tyrosine kinases or JAK kinases in this course. So I'll just simplify the number of receptors you've got to think about from 4 to 2. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. So ion channels, ligand-gated ion channels are a type of receptor. Here's the receptor, here's the ligand, here are the ions. Here is the ligand, which, now this is a figure from the Cell Phys textbook. The ligand, the signaling molecule, the neurotransmitter, or hormone in some cases, opens the ion channel and ions flow. And you're going to be working with this concept in the problem set. And we'll be talking more about what ion flow means on Thursday. This one's pretty simple. Ligands bind, conformation change, ions flow down their concentration. Pretty straightforward. But very, very important, and we will be using it over and over and over again. Here is the figure from your textbook about G-protein coupled receptors. This is the classic case of a GPCR that is coupled, that it forms the coupling between a receptor and protein kinase A. So this is the classic G-protein coupled receptor pathway. Here's the way your book illustrates it, which I dislike for a number of reasons. One is it makes the receptor big and the G-protein small, which is just wrong. And, well, that's the most offensive thing about it. So here is the way it looks. Here's closer to the way it really looks. Here's the receptor. Here's the G-protein, the alpha and the beta gamma sub complexes. Remember, the G-proteins are an alpha, beta, gamma heterotrimer. The G-protein is, in fact, quite a lot bigger than the receptor. And size doesn't really matter here, but, I mean, this figure just is wrong. But it's got some things right. It's got the alpha subunit in the membrane. It's a membrane protein. It's got the beta gamma subunit associated with the membrane, which is right. So that part of it is right. It's got the adenylyl cyclase in the membrane. That's right. It's got the adenylyl cyclase approximately the same size as the receptor. That's about right. It just has the, I don't know why it shrunk the G protein so badly. Here's the way it really looks. And so here is a figure from Cell Phys that we went through, and I'm going to ask you to remember the story. So let's take 5 minutes now in a writing exercise, and you can work in groups. You can turn around and work in groups of 4 if you like. Write the story in the box I gave you that's going on here. Remembering that arrows have meaning.
You want to
They have words associated. Go ahead and write it out. Let's go through it. And then we'll
We
pick it.
want something. Yeah. What year was it? That's what I thought, like you were.
Yeah.
Biochem did? That's what I thought.
Exactly. So 5 minutes.
You were studying. I wasn't very fast. So that's what I was like, I know what. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure, because that means we both had like a perspective.
Yeah. And then of course, I was in anatomy.
Oh, that's right. I was. You covered.
Oh, no.
You covered it 3 times. So should we go through?
Well, I think one of these classes.
Cobwebs for me. I'm only gonna keep. So you start with it's inactive, right? So it has the GDP on it, right? And then when there's some kind of signal molecule binds to there to the GP, the receptor, it has the levels alpha. So this is like a legend. I'm making a better deal with you. Are you sure? Oh, I'll take it. It might be 7. I'm just thinking of the more 11 sort of movie. And that causes a conformational change, right? And then that makes it more favorable for GDP to be swapped out for GTP, which causes another conformational change and actually detaches the alpha subunit. Which then it goes.
Okay, let's start. So what is being illustrated here? The receptor. Why does it always draw? Why the classic cartoon of a G protein coupled receptor has this sort of snaky thing going through the membrane? Why is that? Hayden?
You have 7 alpha units.
The classic structure of a GPCR has 7 transmembrane helices, which is what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 transmembrane helices. That's what that snake is representing. What are these zigzags representing on the alpha and the gamma subunit of the G protein? Anchors, lipid anchors. The zigzags are supposed to be fatty acid tails. Lipid anchors. In the inactive state, the G protein alpha subunit has GDP bound. That's what's being shown here. This is the GDP binding site, and GDP is occupying the site, and the G protein is off. What are these arrows supposed? I put these in. The textbook didn't have them. What are those arrows supposed to indicate? That the G protein can form a complex with the receptor, even in the absence of ligand. But it's usually a low affinity interaction. And so your book cartooned it as being unassociated, but sometimes this G protein can be physically connected, non-covalently connected, making contact with the receptor. Okay? What is embedded in this arrow? A signal molecule diffuses and binds to the receptor. What are these blasty things? Conformational change, activating the receptor. The binding of the signal molecule causes a conformational change of the receptor. That conformational change is communicated to the G protein, and what is being illustrated right here? The GDP is still there, so it's not dissociated yet, and we don't see an arrow of it unbinding. But what is the difference between here and here? Lower affinity, right? The GDP is bound less tightly because of the conformational change that was transmitted to the G protein alpha 7. Here is GDP dissociating. After GDP dissociates, the site is vacant, and that vacant site can be occupied by GTP. So the signal, the activator, the activating ligand, conformational change of the G protein alpha, dissociation of GDP, association of GTP is what activates the G protein. What is being illustrated here? Tell me the story here, somebody. What? Did you hear that in the back? You could, good. She said it just right. The activated alpha now has a low affinity for its beta gamma, so the beta gamma separates. She said kicks off. That's a little bit more active than it really is for molecules, but the beta gamma separates from the activated alpha. And now the activated alpha and the activated beta gamma can go on to activate some things now. Because the activated beta gamma is now, this beta gamma is not the same as this beta gamma, because this beta gamma is mopped up by an alpha, and this beta gamma is not. This alpha is different from this alpha because it's been activated by GTP. Okay, so let's take a break. So here are the stories. Here are the words. I'll leave this up during the break if you want to fill in your handout. But this will be up on Moodle, in half an hour. Let's take a short break. We have activated a G protein because we've activated its receptor. Let's go on and talk about the classic intracellular signaling pathway that is downstream from this activated G protein. So, in your textbook, the thing that is activated by the G protein is an enzyme called adenylyl cyclase. This is the classic pathway. Adenylyl cyclase activated by GS alpha. So now we're going to be talking about different G proteins. GS for stimulatory. G stimulatory alpha subunit stimulates adenylyl cyclase. That's the classic response to GS. GS activates adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase is an enzyme that converts ATP into cyclic AMP. That's what it does when it is activated by GS alpha subunit. What is missing from this figure? If this G protein is activated, what has to be? GTP should be, there should be a little star here that indicates that GTP is present. You can decorate your figure to say that GTP is bound to this alpha if this alpha is activating adenylyl cyclase. The activated adenylyl cyclase makes cyclic AMP from ATP. Cyclic AMP is the second messenger because it is a small molecule and it is diffusible in the cytoplasm. in this classic pathway, cyclic AMP activates protein kinase A. What is a kinase? An enzyme that phosphorylates. Why do we call this protein kinase A? Because it's activated by cyclic A, MP. Just trying to unpack some of this jargon, make a little bit more sense. So cyclic AMP activates PKA. Cyclic AMP, now, your book doesn't go into this, but I want you to know that cyclic AMP binds to regulatory subunits of PKA and kicks them off, just like Maureen said. In this case, it kicks off the regulatory subunits, leaving the active catalytic subunits of PKA. Cyclic AMP binds to regulatory subunits. That binding causes a conformational change that kicks them off, activating the catalytic subunit. The regulatory subunit is a negative regulator. Anyway, PKA now is catalytically active, and PKA can phosphorylate lots and lots of things, changing the properties of the cell, of all kinds of cells. This is the classic GS story. So refresh your memory of this classic GS story. We didn't cover in Sal Phys, but if S stands for stimulatory, which it does, and I stands for inhibitory, which it does, what do you think is the GI story? I'll go through it. Binding to a receptor. The receptor activates GI. Not GS now, a different receptor, different G protein, GI. GI alpha, what does it do? What is GI alpha, GTP ligand, what does the activated GI alpha do to adenylyl cyclase? Inhibits it. Less cyclic AMP, less PKA, less phosphorylation. It just turns off. GI turns off what GS turns on. There's another way to turn off what GS turns on, and that is phosphodiesterase. Adenylyl cyclase makes cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP activates PKA, but cyclic AMP is hydrolyzed by phosphodiesterase proteins, enzymes that break down cyclic AMP. So we have two ways of turning off what cyclic AMP and GS turn on. We could turn on a GI coupled receptor, and that would inhibit adenylyl cyclase. Or we could turn on phosphodiesterase, and that would break down cyclic AMP. Concept here is that, remember, there's things that turn things off. So don't just remember the turning on. Think about what turns things off. In this case now we've got two turn-offs. Okay, so here is a question of great pharmacological relevance because I'm over-caffeinated. Caffeine is a phosphodiesterase inhibitor. So it's a drug that inhibits phosphodiesterase. And it is an antagonist. So I'm using some language, antagonist. It's a drug that inhibits GI-coupled receptors. They happen to be adenosine receptors. So caffeine is a very useful drug, you all, many of you know what I'm talking about. Caffeine has two modes of action. It inhibits phosphodiesterase, and it inhibits a receptor that is coupled to GI. What does caffeine do to intracellular cyclic AMP levels? One best answer. So I tricked some of them. The best answer is A. Caffeine inhibits an inhibitor. So, right? Caffeine inhibits phosphodiesterase. So go back. By inhibiting phosphodiesterase, more cyclic AMP can build up. When acting on PDE, it decreases cyclic AMP. Okay, that can't be right. When acting on phosphodiesterase, it increases cyclic AMP. So now we're down to A or D. Now let's think about when caffeine inhibits a GI-coupled receptor. It inhibits GI, so it allows GS to have more power. So there's more cyclic AMP because GS has more power, because the inhibitor has been inhibited. The concept here is that inhibition of inhibition can allow stimulation, right? A double negative. If you take a coin with heads and you flip it over once and you flip it over again, you've got heads again. So D is wrong because when acting on adenosine receptors, it decreases it. No, when acting on adenosine receptors, it allows it to increase. So A is the best answer. The concept is inhibition of inhibition. You'll recall from CalPhys, so we've covered two GPCRs in general. GS-coupled GPCRs and GI-coupled GPCRs. I haven't gotten into all the different types of ligands for them, but the general concepts are out there. Now we're going to talk about GQ-coupled GPCRs. You'll remember, let's walk through the story. What happened here? Two words. One begins with D, one begins with B. Diffusion and binding. What happens here? So this, I don't love this cartoon, but what happens here then after diffusion and binding? Conformational change. What's embedded here? There's lots going on here that is lost. GDP, so conformational change of the alpha. GDP dissociates, it's all here. GTP binds, it's all here but hidden. GTP liganded alpha Q activates phospholipase C, not adenylyl cyclase, a different effector. GQ is different from GS. GQ activates phospholipase C. The beta gamma in this cartoon are not doing anything. But between you and me, these beta gammas also can activate phospholipase C. So here, no, sorry. Phospholipase C. What does phospholipase C do? So what is embedded in this arrow? What is this arrow indicating? Okay, good. Interacting with. There's a better word for interacting with. Catalyzes the hydrolysis. Phospholipase C hydrolyzes PIP2, which is a lipid. That's why this is in the membrane. PIP2 is a lipid Phospholipase C is a protein, it's an enzyme, that hydrolyzes PIP2 into IP3 and diacylglycerol. Now, here we've got a problem because diacylglycerol stays in the membrane and IP3 is released into the cytoplasm. IP3 is pretty hydrophilic and diacylglycerol is very hydrophobic. Diacylglycerol, these are the two products of phospholipase C. What's embedded in this arrow? Diffusion. Binding to calcium, so lots hidden here. Diffusion and binding to calcium channels in the ER. I call them calcium release channels because when they activate, they release calcium from the ER. So what is this arrow? This is calcium coming out of the ER, where it was stored. What put the calcium in the ER in the first place? One word, SERCA. There it is. SERCA. Remember, sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase. The calcium pump, the SERCA calcium pump, put the calcium there, and now the IP3 gated calcium release channels are allowing calcium to come out. SERCA turns off the calcium signal by pumping it into the ER. IP3 turns on the calcium signal by allowing it to come out of the ER. Calcium does lots of things. Calcium is a very important, promiscuous activator of various cell responses. This cartoon shows calcium and diacylglycerol activating protein kinase C. What does the C stand for in this story? It's the most important C in this story. Calcium. Protein kinase C is activated by calcium and by diacylglycerol. And it phosphorylates many things. Calcium, but let's not forget calcium, in addition to activating PKC, activates lots of other things. And we'll see those things over the course of the next semester. So this is the GQ story. Let's end with a quick yeah. Diacylglycerol and calcium are co-activators of PKC. So either one alone can activate PKC, but together they maximally activate PKC.
So is DAG fully hydrophobic? Because as the arrow says, it goes.
This is wrong. DAG stays in the membrane. PKC is membrane associated.
Okay.
Which of the following would cause an increase in cyclic AMP? Activation of voltage-gated calcium channels, which are on the surface membrane of almost all cells, especially neurons and endocrine cells that we're focused on. So A is yes, B is no, C is maybe, which is a curveball. Which of the following would cause an increase in cyclic AMP? Increase in cytoplasmic calcium. Activation of voltage-gated calcium channels. See lots of A's? Yes. A is the correct answer. Activation of calcium release channels on the endoplasmic reticulum. Would activation of those channels increase cytoplasmic calcium concentrations? Yes. Activation of a GS-coupled receptor. Yes, no, or maybe? I think the best answer is maybe. because it depends on what protein kinase A phosphorylates. If protein kinase A were to phosphorylate and activate calcium channels, then calcium would go up. If protein kinase A were to phosphorylate and activate calcium pumps, then calcium would go down. And both of those things happen, depending on the cell type. So C is the best answer to that one. Activation of a GQ coupled receptor. A. And finally, activation of SERCA or PMCA. Is that going to, yes, no, or maybe, increase cytosolic calcium? Activation of PMCA, best answer here would be B. It's going to decrease cytoplasmic calcium. It is not going to increase cytoplasmic calcium. Activation of a non-specific non-specific cation channel. So what am I getting at here? Calcium is a cation. Non-specific means it doesn't care what cations. So calcium could go through this channel, and it would flow in, and that would increase calcium in this cell. Okay, so here are the answers to that last clicker. I started to go fast because I'm running out of time. Use the PowerPoint, your notes, your reading to understand all of these questions. I'm happy to answer questions about it this afternoon at 1 o'clock. Remember, or at another time. Remember, if you haven't told me, I'm assuming you'll come to Stanley 044 at 1 o'clock this afternoon.